Markets. My name's Chris Bailey. Thanks so much for coming to this session. We're going to talk about Africa. Interesting continent. I was doing a bit of research over the last few days, and if you look at people like the International Monetary Fund, they think over the next 10 years, Africa's going to see the second biggest consumption growth of any continent behind Asia, and a doubling of manufacturing production. So some amazing growth potential. The question is, should we be investing there? And if so, how should we be doing it? And what are some of the risks in doing that? Now, you're not here to listen to my thoughts. You're here to hear the thoughts of the four gentlemen to my right, who are all experts in Africa through their various business interests. We've got here Andrew Bell from Red Rock Resources, Rob Scott from Anglo-African Agriculture, Ahmed Dick from Victoria Oil and Gas, and Colin Bird, of course, from Jubilee Metals. And the first question I think we've got to think about is, Andrew, is Africa the new Asia? Is that the right way to think about it? Massive opportunity, huge potential, currently undervalued by stock markets.
Yes, well, I think one of the things that's really quite useful if one wants to get a new perspective on the world is to go to the CIA fact book, which is one of the most useful resources online, because you can see a demographic chart 4 years by 4 years for men and for women for every country in the world. And from the shape of this graph, you can deduce quite a lot. Things you'd expect, like the German one going right like this at the bottom, the French and the British slightly like this, because immigration means that we have almost replacement, or more than replacement of the population. The fast-growing countries of Asia and South America, as we think, they've actually slowed down their growth rates a lot. You want to see a perfect pyramid going like this. You should have a look at the charts for Congo and for Ethiopia and Nigeria. It'll blow you away. So that's, and of course everyone knows Egypt has quite a big population, but those are huge and growing populations. So if you look at growth of population, decline in childhood mortality, increase in life expectancies, yes, Africa is going to be where the population increases are going to occur.
So very exciting sort of demographic, big picture stuff. Colin, you're an experienced investor across the continent. South Africa, that's the country we think about most as personifying Africa. What's happening there? Are the changes there very positive? The new president? Could this be a catalyst for actually a better continental performance over the next 10 years?
Well, I always saw South Africa, excuse me, Cape Town being the investment centre for the whole of Africa. Sadly, that was a dream. I went to South Africa at the breakdown of apartheid, and the new charter, thinking this was the start. This was the start of the Renaissance, thriving junior sector, once again funding Africa, real investment banking down there, Cape Town and Joburg, and the growth of South Africa would be seen. A thriving stock market, I expected, and within 2 years, the fund managers were all back to dividend, and the measure was the size of the dividend. Absolutely zilch interest in growth. And my particular dream, because I love South Africa, of Cape Town and Kobe and the feeder for the rest of South Africa, just didn't work out. We've seen the past politics and a new president, as you say, that all augurs good, and particularly in as much as the new president, of course, was the founder of the first black union, which gives him huge credibility. And secondly, of course, he went out into the world and did things. He was smart enough not to get on the presidential bandwagon too soon. And he went out, he went into industry and got himself a nice share in McDonald's, I think it was, and that wasn't a bad start, was it? Got involved as a black empowerment group for Lonmin, etc., etc. So I think you've got a well-qualified president. I think a president not without challenges. You know, I don't think you go to be the new president after the last few years expecting to be able to put in place all you want to put in place. I think you've got a very powerful ANC, you've got a very fractured ANC, you've got a very disenchanted electorate Having said all those things, I sound negative about South Africa, but I'm extremely positive because my measure is you get off the plane and you're going into town, and I measure prosperity with cranes. And there's lots of those. And I measure myself with my own daft approach to life is every time I see a new office block being built, they'll never fill it. They always fill it. So I look at South Africa and I look at an emerging democracy. It had its past, it's got its future. And cultural styles, it's not within the South African, it's not within the combat conflict is usually resolved on a face-to-face, and then there's lots of behind the scenes. And I think that's how South Africa as a fledgling democracy tried to run things, and it's just not run like that. So I think there'll be change there, there'll be challenges. South Africa, of course, is, when you look at a lot of the metals are deep, you know, what metals they have got, particularly the gold mine industry, deep, hot and difficult. So from my perspective, they're out that game. Surface projects, not too many. And other industries have overtaken, of course, the mining business. So I would suggest that if you want to make money in South Africa from mining, or you want to make money in South Africa, mining is probably not the best thing to be. With the exception, of course, that with the name of mine is Jubilee Platinum, who's found the secret of low entry, low capital cost, quick return on investment, and have a multiple portfolio of investments, which obviously working well for the company, and what a transformation in 2 years. But
as always with Colin,
finishing that what with the changes we're seeing in Zimbabwe, amazing, very, very good, and from an economy, which is quite surprising, really. It's surrounded by big mining culture. By definition, Zimbabwe's always been small, and now the opportunity to integrate some of these mines, I think one should look very closely at Zimbabwe. So South Africa is a place to invest, yes. In the resource sector, I'm not sure, but surrounding South Africa are extremely good opportunities. And whether South Africa will be the prime mover to these opportunities, not so sure.
So they're from Colin. Crane watch and a company push as well. Ahmed, you're an expert in oil and gas. Historically, Africa's been very much focused on the development of its commodity resources. Should that still be the focus? Are the resources so exciting that that should be the primary focus of the African economy? Or actually, is there a broader story here in terms of the consumer, urbanization, and other matters like that?
Thanks, Chris. I'm not sure if I'm an expert, but I'll accept it from you anyway. Thank you. I think there's quite a large amount of untapped resources in Africa, pretty much in every country in Africa, ranging from mining to oil and gas to many others. There are a lot of opportunities for many companies. I mean, our company, we're integrated gas utility operating in Cameroon currently. We are looking for additional assets to broaden our portfolio base into West Africa. I think it is. The resources need to be tapped to be able to bring further prosperity into each of those countries. I think an important aspect which a lot of countries are trying to do, but I think not successfully doing it, is to be able to have a value add in any of their production, whether it's oil and gas or mining or the minerals or anything of that nature. So I think for everyone to succeed, country, people, and the companies, I think there needs to be value add as a priority in each and every country, which seems to be, I think, not becoming not a priority, even though it's spoken about, but I don't think it really happens. A secondary aspect of that, I think a key thing in tapping that resource, or whatever it is, requires government support and continual government support. I think what we're seeing in the later years of any investment, I'm sure the guys at the panel agree, is that there's always government support at first, and you're in there and you're putting some money, and as soon as you're got the money in the country and into the asset and the company, laws and rules start changing, and I think that's where companies start struggling. And I'm sure the BPs, the Shells, and the BHPs and the Rio Tintos of the world can handle that a lot better because they've got much sort of deeper pockets and bigger balance sheets. The smaller companies seem to struggle a lot more with that because effectively, what we're seeing happening in places like Tanzania, you could call that a sort of effectively a backdoor nationalisation with the introduction of such large taxes. those sort of attitudes, to be able to tap into resources, to get that sort of attitude from the government, starts detracting away foreign investment. And I think as much as people have got the ability to come in and monetize assets in Africa, there's a detraction from government to be able to push investors away from country to country. And every country obviously has its own different level of risk in that sense. I hope that answers.
Thanks very much. Absolutely. We're going to touch on regulation and governments in a second because it's super important in the commodity sector, mining, oil and gas and related. First of all, agriculture, Rob. It seems to me the most amazing stat about Africa is just the proportion of imports of food that they undertake. And surely that's a huge opportunity where Africa can actually feed itself coherently. Surely that in itself would just boost economic potential and have massive impacts on the overall continent's economy. What do you think about that?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think we're not involved in agriculture, we're involved in agri-processing. And I think, to sort of my colleagues is, I really, as a business, would invest in basic foodstuffs because governments change and they're quite populist. So if you're having problems, they'll nationalize your farm sooner than you'd wish. With that said, Africa has got the most unproductive land in the world, and you'll see throughout the world, Middle East, Far East, governments are taking large tracts of land and very good tracts of land to grow food, to export, not necessarily to feed Africa, but to export. And I think, sort of Africa does miss a beat. I think they do change. And if they see somebody successful, they'll change the laws to try and get more royalties, whatever the case may be. So there certainly is a reticence against that. And the reality of it is Africa's had a fairly large corruption rate. And I think with this day and age of compliance, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, people don't want to invest in any country where there's any whiff of corruption. But I mean, with that said, I think in terms of the Millennium Goals, all African countries committed to large investment into agriculture and agri-processing for a couple of reasons. One, it feeds the nation. Two, it's a very large employment creator. Some countries have achieved it, many countries haven't. And I still think it's many, many years of challenges. And I think the other problem that you have in Africa is you have politicians making decisions. And no disrespect to politicians, they're the worst people to make decisions. Let the free market make its decisions. And we talk about value added. I mean, interesting in terms of value added. If you ask who uses the most cocoa, and it's actually the Swiss to make chocolate, and it's not the Ghanaians, okay? And you need to play to your strength. And in Africa, we try and value added the whole time. And it's not necessarily the thing to do. Do what you do and do what you do well, and let the value added happen. And if you take a look at countries like Zimbabwe recently, where you couldn't export chrome ore unless you value added. But there was no power to do it. So you actually took a whole industry and you chucked it down the toilet in the space of 2 weeks because you had politicians making the decisions as opposed to business people taking the decisions. And I think for Africa in the commodity and the agricultural space to flourish, they need to take the investment, they need to let the investment run, and they need to have the rule of law that if you're going to invest in an agricultural project, that you're going to be there for 20 years. Because agriculture on its own is not the most lucrative business you'll ever have. It's the value added that's the lucrative part of the business.
Absolutely, and let's try and be value added in this session as well. Let's come back to Andrew. You're experienced in Africa. Where should the audience be investing their money today, with the exception of your own company? What sort of themes, what sort of companies, what sort of ideas?
The audience going and investing in Africa themselves?
For themselves, yeah.
Investing in companies?
In stocks, or there's not many collective products. Maybe you can get it second-hand via large companies that have significant African exposure. How would you play it?
Well, and I think that there are a lot of companies to choose from, and there's a very great deal that I don't know. Someone like Colin is more familiar with the universe of companies doing business in Africa. I know a few, but I think there's a template you can apply, some general principles First, when you look at countries, see what stage they're at, because every country goes through a stage where it's trying to get investment in, where they offer very favorable terms, and then everyone invests, and then if one president doesn't do it, another will, because the political pressures mount up and the MPs start to talk about it. The pressure goes on, particularly if commodity prices go up, for increased royalties or increased tax rates. And some of the big companies then say, we're going to leave, this makes it uneconomic, we'll leave forever. And they don't, or others replace them, and it carries on. This happens in one country after another. And eventually, sometimes they kill the goose that lays the eggs, and then you have to get out. So you have to choose the country that is apparently at a benign stage in the investment cycle, and that doesn't look as if...
where would you highlight? Which region, country, theme? What would you highlight as... what do you think is interesting?
Then I also think you have to see where governance changes are taking place and making the place better to invest in, and you have to see which commodities are in favor. I mean, I think that if you take a country that I went through much of my adult life thinking somewhere where you'd never go and invest because they didn't really have the rule of law, Congo, has suddenly got much better. If Randgold will go to the Congo, if Ivanhoe will go to the Congo, if Glencore will go to the Congo, and if you look at the managements of those three companies, they're probably the smartest mining managements I know, wouldn't you say?
Certainly most successful.
Most successful. Then that's telling you something about Congo having improved as an investment destination. So knowing it has some of the richest resources, the highest grades of minerals anywhere, you might be tempted to put a little bit of the risk part of your portfolio in some company that you thought could handle the risks and the opportunities in Congo.
Yeah.
But really, since Africa's a country of so many, a continent of so many countries, and there are so many different political organizations and so many different political problems in different places, you have to look and make your decisions with that in mind. I agree with what Colin's saying about South Africa. Don't believe the press. South Africa is quite successful. And when you saw in Asia, in Taiwan and Korea, them going from the stages of being very corrupt to when they started cashiering their presidents or ex-presidents and sending them to prison, this is because the middle class had reached a size where they could do that. So when you see a middle class reaching a critical level, the country transitions. I suggest that what happened to Zuma and the way so many people decided corruption was too much and he had to be got rid of, and the way this was handled was a great sign of growing political maturity in South Africa and gives me a lot of confidence in future investment in that country.
And it's interesting, if you look, Andrew mentioned before about demographics and the development of urbanization and related, absolutely true about the middle classes. You look at a country like Kenya or Uganda or Nigeria, this is what's coming over the next 20 years. And I completely agree, it changes the investment backdrop for the positive. Colin, kind of interesting what Andrew said about Congo. What I find interesting, and hearing what Glencore and Randgold have been talking about, has been the DRC government has started changing some of the terms of engagement. You know all about terms of engagement being changed in places like South Africa with the PGM area. What are you thinking? Is it still workable? Is it just a game between companies and governments that just goes on? Can we invest with a degree of confidence in these areas with these companies or not?
I think it's very unfair to single Africa out in that context. The best guy at moving the goalpost was Bill Clinton, so you know, and the Bushes weren't too bad at it either. So to single out South Africa for changing the goalpost to Africa for changing the goalpost, I think is most unfair. What we want as miners, as businessmen, is to invest in with clear transparency, and that's why the majority of what I do is Africa focused. That's why the majority of what I do is the eastern side of Africa, where the English language is spoken, because by definition, not by definition, but by default, the legal system will probably be English. So title is understood, mining codes, investment codes are transparent, and you can invest with confidence and know if you're lucky or your science works well, then you can build a mine or you can build a factory, depending what you're doing. When one goes to the other side, and you've got the French-speaking nations, I'm not so sure. because there's extremely bad definition in French company law on ownership and the duties of the local managers and things like that. So I purposely direct myself to where English is spoken and where by default, as I say, that English law prevails. So I think it's very unfair to label Africa for moving the goalpost. And I'd be very, very defensive, in fact, and go the other way, that occasionally we see some crazy things happen, but often they should have happened, probably, when licenses are taken away, licenses are revoked, income taxes are imposed. No good just jumping down upon this, on the spot, and it happened in the Congo quite a bit. No good jumping out on the spot saying that's not fair. In reality, if you're given a license, if you're given a program of works which you have to complete, and you fail, why cry? You can't cry because it's a young democracy. You wouldn't cry in America, you wouldn't cry in Russia or Eastern Europe, so why go crying in America? And I think a lot of companies around the world, a lot of companies in Africa are probably too full of themselves and think they can always get around the system. They're bigger than the system. Their money's bigger than the system. And there's been lots of examples where in actual fact they're not, and they say, well, you signed up for this is what you'll deliver. And if you don't, quite frankly, I'm on the other side here. If you don't deliver, get ready for the consequences. And you wouldn't expect it in America, so why expect it in parts of Africa?
Ahmed, what do you think about the oil and gas sector in the sense that lots of companies are looking at Africa, involved in Africa in the space? We all know the oil price has gone up recently. It appears set fair for the future. What confidence do you have in terms of rules and regulations, clarity over the sort of underlying business environment that you can operate in and other companies as well?
When you're investing in countries in Africa, I think there's an expectation that laws will change at some point. I don't think anyone sitting here is expected it's just going to flow as is from day one. The risk is always there to be able to look at it and say, oh, this could change if I do it in a particular manner. I think important management teams to maintain control of that and be abreast of situations. I mean, in Cameroon, we had a situation last year where the budget paper was coming out and they were going to implement a 30% tax on use of gas in industries. That would have effectively killed our business. Our tax advisor informed us that. We got a copy of the draft paper. There was a huge amount of lobbying from the Prime Minister level to various ministries to be able to ensure that industry tax wasn't implemented. They finally saw some sense and logic and did not implement that. So I think it's just a matter of, you just got to remain on top of the business and the laws and see what's coming in. Because otherwise, it just gets snuck in from underneath. There's no, I don't think I've seen, if anyone else can correct me, but a industry body who's appointed as a workforce or a task force in a country to determine if we implement a tax of such, how it would affect the industry in country. I don't think that ever happens, and I don't think I've ever heard of that happening. It's just, I think one of the gentlemen, he just said that there's a politicians making decisions, and that's what happens. I mean, someone sits there saying, government needs more money, what do we do? The oil and gas sector is making quite a bit of money, let's just implement the tax there, without any thought going into what the consequences of that decision would be. And I think that's where governments are failing, allowing those politicians to make those unilateral decisions going forward. Investing in Africa is prosperous. I mean, yes, it will make money for a lot of companies. Yes, we've made money in Africa. We continue to invest in Africa. And I think there's going to be a lot more money going into Africa. But I think governments in Africa need to be reminded, and I say this regularly with other conferences I go to, is that to attract foreign investment into countries, you do need to have a regulatory regime which is respected, which doesn't change regularly, and which is welcoming to foreign investment. There are various kinds of conventions which companies enter into with governments. That's usually followed by the governments, but if a convention of some sort for your investment stipulates a particular corporate tax or a particular VAT and a reduced aspect of other incentives to get the company to invest further, somehow there's a new tax that'll just come around the back, which will start causing issues again. So I think they've got to start realizing that, if they keep doing what they're doing, money's going to start going to other jurisdictions, such as Asia, such as South America, which are, again, very prosperous continents as well.
Absolutely. I think, unfortunately, engagement with politicians and governments often causes a lot of problems. Rob, what's your experience? You must have talked to plenty of governments over your time. How is it for you? Do you find big problems, big changes of the rules, as we've just heard, or is it just easy sailing?
I think there's two issues. I think on the mineral space and the resource space, they do change. The rest of the spaces, they don't change radically. I've generally found when dealing in Africa with governments, whether it's national or local, they're generally actually pretty good on condition. And I'll touch on what Colin said. If you do not respect their laws, and there was a case in Tanzania, there was a company, no names mentioned, that never paid any tax. Okay, and then they upped the tax rate, and in fact, I think they sort of threatened to take away the licenses. And as somebody said to me, if you don't contribute to the fiscus, they don't need you. If you're contributing to the fiscus, they do need you, so they will engage with you. So I worked in the Congo for 5 years. I was never charged, not once, any extra duties. I was never asked for a bribe, not once. And as long as we did our stuff, when we brought the product across the border, we paid our duties in terms of the government handbook, there was no problem. I think if you try and get cute and smart, they'll get cute and smart backwards because they understand you now in the game. So, I think that the mineral space is a difficult space, and particularly if you go to the Congo with cobalt. I think it was $20,000. It's $91,000. It's not unreasonable for the government to say we'd like a little bit of a portion of the $61,000 or $71,000 profit, over and above what the initial item is. And I think, as Colin said, many people come into Africa, think they can, sort of make promises to the government, specifically in the resource space, don't do the work, and claim they want to keep the asset or the concession in perpetuity. It doesn't work like that. Keep to your side of the bargain. So I've found generally, if you keep to your side of the bargain, you generally will have a good time. And you generally can operate. However, on the mineral space, because of the cyclical nature of the mineral space, and you do have these super cycles, and when a super cycle comes, generally they want more money and they will hit you. And so that's always a concern, but I think, you just got to engage them properly, and generally they'll be all right, generally.
Now, I know, Rob, you've got to go, unfortunately, to your next appointment shortly, but so another question to you. What's the best thing our audience can do to improve their chances of investment success in Africa-facing investments? What would be your top tip in terms of something they do, in terms of approach, in terms of looking at something, a theme, anything?
Look, I think the first thing is it's investing in Africa is like investing in the UK. Is find the right jockey, find the right business, trust the numbers behind it, make sure you understand the forecasts, and don't take everything at face value. Have a bit of professional skepticism, which you'd want here. I think from a macro level, as Andrew said, Africa is growing. They've grown the GDP over the last 10 years by 50-60%. Interesting, the UK, which forms part of Europe, the GDP per capita has actually fallen from about $26,000 to $25,000. So it is the right place to go. Just be careful like anything else. Go to the right countries, and there's great countries like Rwanda. They're keen for your money. You can arrive in Kigali, you go to the RDB, the Rwandan Development Board, and they will register your company, your PAYE, your UIF, your VAT, and all your statutory taxes by lunchtime, and then they'll take you for lunch, okay? Because they want your business. The problem with Rwanda is it's a small country. So you're not going to ever grow a unicorn in Rwanda. So you just got to, and you've also got the other big issue is free movement of cash. So many countries, Malawi is a great example, you can bring in cash, and you can, in terms of extractive resources, you can deposit your dollars into your bank account and you'll have dollars in your bank account. Unfortunately, the government has taken those dollars to pay for fuel. So all you've really got is an IOU, and you can't use a Malawian Central Bank IOU to pay. So understand the movement of money, and if you can understand that and you've got a good jockey, I think you've got as good chance of success. And I think the macro indicators all point to you will always make an above average return in Africa currently than most other first world countries.
All right. So Rob says choose a good jockey. Ahmed, what would you say? What would be your top kind of thematic piece of advice for people looking towards African investment opportunities?
I think an important factor is the flow of money. You're going to make sure that whatever project you're looking at, there is going to be security of payment. So whatever you're monetizing, you've got to ensure that payment's going to have to flow, number one, in, and number two, out. So repatriation of profits is an important factor. If you can't get money out of the country, it becomes a massive issue in terms of for that company. So I think I think a lot of projects will work. There's a lot of investment going into Africa. A lot of deals being done with governments with some of the projects. But if there's no security of payment, irrespective of how good or great the project is, it's going to fail.
Yeah, cash flow is always king in investments. Colin, what would be your insight, the thing investors can practically do to improve their chances regarding African investment?
Yeah, I think these, back to investment as a principle. I think here that sooner than say what would you do, I think you could generalise for any country. But the caution I would add, sooner than the recommendation, is that again, by definition, when you've got emerging economies, emerging countries, a youth who was probably disadvantaged, and the middle-aged groups who were disadvantaged under previous regimes for whatever reason, political or otherwise. So the propensity for failure, the propensity for dreams to be put to the market without any underlying gravitas credibility, I think the propensity might be much, much, much greater. So I would say that anybody who wants to invest in that part of the economy, the emerging sector, which is young, which is starved of cash, be extremely careful. And then at the top end, be careful of the Mr. Fix-Its and the people who are thereby, for whatever wrong reason, in the positions they're in, and are extremely unlikely to grow a business and probably more likely to feed off a business. So I think the general principles of investment always rule from my point of view, with the exception of be very careful of the emerging entrepreneur, because he may well not be as well versed, as well experienced, as well financed, and able to deliver the promises he might be making.
Andrew, final word to you. What do you think? What would be your suggestion?
Much the same as Colin. I think it's you need enormous patience sometimes, because but the general principle of investment, let's face it, are the same as they are anywhere in the world. And businesses that succeed tend to succeed for the same reasons, and ones that fail usually fail for the obvious reasons. Every now and then you get a really bad piece of luck, like we had something in Kenya where the local MP was trying to muscle in, and he created problems. It ended up with us having to take the government to court, and they want to settle some years later, and that will sort itself out. But I'm not discouraged by that. Why we've got to know the Kenyan political system much better and our way around much better as a result of that. We didn't give up and go away, which is a point that has made it much easier for us to cope. So, yeah, you need patience. You need to be willing to go into a country realizing that you have to serve your apprenticeship there. And that does mean, as Colin says, that if as an investor you're doing this at one remove, you should look for people who've done it before, or who are specialists, or who know the country well, because you can't just walk into an African country and compete. You can't, can you?
I can't, no.
Thanks very much. Thanks to Rob, Ahmed, Colin and Andrew. Final word from me. Those of you who know me and know I'm a larger cap investor, My 3 tips from the equivalent panel from last year, quick update on those. Old Mutual, I hope you bought it. Fantastic spin-off, split-up story. I think it's largely now in the price. Randgold, we've heard from Colin, I think, talking positively about it. I would totally agree with that. And my final one, PZ Cussons. I was patient. If those of you who read Share Profits, check out my article on that a month or so ago. I bought the stock recently. So a few ideas. Thank you very much for listening. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you very much.
Yeah,